Okay.
Okay. With the money they already have.
That's a very good question. I mean, the answer to all that is yes and yes and yes in some sense. There isn't enough money spent on education, but in fact, it's fair to say that America spends more than any other OECD country on education per pupil. So starting with money and its lack is probably not the right place to start. But if you examine carefully what we spend money on, what's quite striking is proportionally little of it is spent on instruction and its improvement, which is exactly what has to do with student opportunities to learn and learning. We spend far more of it on things that actually have very little to do with instruction. So in part it's about reallocating what we spend money on. And once you get into the weeds on that, you find that there are costs associated with schooling that could be handled differently. So in some ways we would need major financial reforms, not just more money being spent. But to begin with, districts could do better to the extent that they can allocate money toward instruction and the improvement of instruction, which means teacher training, teachers' opportunities to learn. But if you wanted to do something radical, like reorganize schooling so that teachers had time to work on the development of lessons for students and examining student work carefully the way they do in Japan, for example, or in China, that would cost a lot of money because right now we spend money to have teachers teaching all day long and there's no time for them the way there is in other countries to actually do work. For example, a university faculty member doesn't teach all day long. The person teaches and then looks at student work and meets with students individually. Public school teaching isn't structured like that. It's all face-to-face time. So that would cost more money. So your question is complicated. Yes, more money could be spent, but some of it has to do with, to begin with, how we spend it, what we do have. The issue of standardized testing goes back further than the commercialization issue. You're right to be asking that question, but one thing that distinguishes the United States from other countries is that we're one of the few sort of highly developed nations where the testing that we submit kids to has nothing to do with the curriculum that they take. In fact, AP courses, you're in an AP course, are the only courses we offer in which the tests are actually directly aligned to what was taught. The other tests that students in this country take are generalized tests that are deliberately designed to be separate from the instruction. This is very weird. When people in other countries see that that's what we do, they find that one of the more bizarre features of our system. So it is true that the commercialization of standardized testing is having an impact, but it goes back further to the faith we have in this very separate form of testing that's not aligned with the courses that students are actually studying. And so to change that, you would actually have to go back to make the tests much more closely related to actually what students are being taught. That's a complicated question about No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind had many features about it that, in principle, made sense, which is to try to hold districts much more accountable for equitable outcomes for students. For example, preventing disaggregated achievement data so that one could see how students who are members of different groups were succeeding in a district. Before No Child Left Behind, that was never a requirement. But I think most people are aware that almost everything about the way No Child Left Behind was implemented didn't live up to any of the original sort of principles of the legislation and in fact is in need of great overhaul. For example, the ways in which states were allowed to set cut scores means that in order to meet federal guidelines, there's no assurance at all that no child is being left behind whatsoever. Moreover, there were wildly different cut scores by states, and so the overall effort to raise achievement didn't really work. Moreover, there were rapid assumptions about how fast these changes would occur. If you've ever looked at one of these charts that shows the targets of what level of achievement could be expected from one year to the next, nobody in their right mind could have expected that to be possible. So the original idea that we'd be more accountable, particularly to low income and racial minority students, was a very good idea. Almost nothing about the way the legislation was designed or implemented was.
What would be a good way of changing that? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, we keep trying to do things that use accountability as a lever, and while it is important to look at data and to hold districts or teachers or schools accountable, if you don't build in support for changing practice, you're very unlikely to get results. And the history of education reform in this country is one of two types: either to supply curriculum materials. There's been lots of periods in which what we did is we spent money on building new curriculum, new science curriculum, for example, or we do testing and hold districts accountable for that. But if you notice, neither of those is about capacity building. And In the business world, if you expect something to change, you don't just measure it, you actually build up capacity and provide training, and we very rarely do that in this country. Well, one thing to keep in mind, I know you're interested in the role of the federal government. The federal government role in education is very small. Only 9% of the money spent on education in this country comes from the federal government, and most of that is categorical funding. So most of the control over education is at the state level. The Constitution grants authority to states to run education. So questions about the federal role, you need to keep a perspective on how minor it is in the overall picture. If your question is what's missing from our effort to have a top-rate education system, the number one issue I would pick is a true system of professional preparation of teachers. So I'm the dean of a school of education. We obviously prepare teachers here, but the way that teachers get prepared at the University of Michigan is really very different from the way they're prepared at most other institutions. And moreover, there are something like 3,000 different programs preparing teachers in this country, and they all do it differently, and there are almost no requirements for becoming a teacher that is entering a school district. It's a completely chaotic system, since teachers are the key factor within schools that make a difference in kids' learning. And the fact that we don't actually organize to do that in a professional way, the way we do with nurses or physicians or social workers or even airplane pilots, is probably the biggest gap in our overall system.
Well, on a related note, what it would, if this is just sort of an if or, no, would it be legislation requirements or higher salaries that would make better teachers?
Higher salaries wouldn't accomplish a lot by itself. That doesn't mean teachers shouldn't be paid more, but if you expected to improve the quality of teaching, you wouldn't do it simply by paying people more, because that assumes somehow that the only reason people aren't teaching well now is that they're not being paid enough, and if we paid them more, they'd say, oh, like, now I'll teach better. So salaries are a good idea, but they're not a lever for improvement by themselves. So it's not even so much that one would need more regulation, it's that one would need to assure that there were requirements for what you have to demonstrate before you get a teaching license. So for example, in order to fly an airplane or become a nurse, you have to pass individual boards where you demonstrate that you can carry out key practices of that field, whether it's to land planes or deliver babies or whatever it is. With teaching, there's nothing that teachers actually have to demonstrate practically before they're allowed to begin teaching students. Instead, we assume that people will learn on the job. But while they're learning on the job, there are real students in their classes who don't learn. So we would need a different system in which there's not only very deliberate training the way there is in most other fields, but there would be requirements that individuals had to demonstrate before they were given a license for teaching. And that would be a revolution in this country. So you'd start with that, and if you did that, you could actually start differentiating pay and pay people more for better work. But just starting with pay wouldn't get you very far. So you wanted to know whether the way that I was trained is different than the way we train teachers today. And in fact, it's not so much that teacher training has changed over the years, it's that programs vary terrifically. And the program I was in, of which there are some like that still, was a program in which we had a lot of clinical training, and we also had a year's internship, which is very unusual. But probably the most important thing and representative of what we're doing at Michigan is that it's critical that teacher preparation focus on key skills that teachers need to be able to be effective with students, like leading a whole class discussion or being able to diagnose common difficulties that students have in their subject. If a teacher encounters a student having trouble in a math class and has no idea why that student is having trouble, the main thing that teacher can do is just repeat what he or she said the first time, but often misses the mark about what the student is misunderstanding. So diagnostic capability would be an example. Leading a whole class discussion would be another. Writing really good tests would be another. And these are all things that people can be taught to do, but most teacher preparation is much looser than that. It places people in schools to kind of have experience and assumes that they'll learn things that way. And then they get jobs and they're supposed to sort of learn on the job. So really high quality teacher training would be more like what we see in other fields, where very specific capabilities would be the focus, and also teachers would have opportunities to learn academic content in a way that enabled them to explain it well to other people instead of just do well on it themselves. So getting an A in, modern algebra at the university level doesn't mean that you know how to explain high school level algebra to high school students. So you have to actually unpack and understand how to explain the content to someone else. So good teacher preparation would focus on that as well.
So if you feel that there's an issue on the state level with funding for education, what do you see as how can that be addressed? What's the best way to go to helping with funding?
Well, one thing that could help, as I said, states differ a lot in how much they spend. So Michigan is kind of in the middle. Some states spend lots more and some states spend a lot less, and the results are unrelated to how much is spent per pupil. There's basically no correlation between per pupil spending and outcomes. But one thing that's quite wasteful across states, and Michigan is no exception, is how much is done locally. So some more things being done in common would be very cost efficient. So an example would be if a state decided to provide professional development, really high quality professional development for all of its math teachers, to go back to the STEM issue, it would be cost effective. You could do some of it online, you could do some of it locally or regionally, and districts would get consistently high quality opportunities for their teachers to improve their work. But instead what we do is we expect every district to do that on its own, which A, costs more money, and B, is often not very good because it's all kind of made up locally. So we're very committed to local control of schools, and I'm just worth pointing out that there's a tension between that desire and being able to be cost effective. Some things should be local, but not everything. So professional development of math teachers doesn't need to be local, and it would be both better uses of money and better quality if we didn't think that needed to be local. So I think some of the energy would have to be put into untangling what really needs to be, local to Ann Arbor and what could be something that was either regional or statewide.
So does Common Core help address that?
The Common Core could help address that by having, not only across districts but across states, some clarity about what students are supposed to be learning, because that is another way in which there's huge variability. When I prepare teachers and I don't know where they're going to get jobs, I can't actually prepare them as well as I would like because I don't know what they're going to be expected to teach. Whereas if I knew that everyone was going to have to teach particular ideas in 4th grade, then when I prepare elementary teachers, I would be able to prepare them much better for starting their first job than when it's actually quite variable what they're likely to be asked to do.
Yeah, sure.
One thing to say about the Common Core, because it's drawn quite a lot of controversy, not only in Michigan but around the country, is that it's actually not a federal program. It's meant to be a coalition of states agreeing across state boundaries about what should be taught and learned. That's already presumably somewhat controversial, but because it was attached to your questions, you're interested in federal role, it was attached to Race to the Top. It became much more tied to federal interventions in schools and actually attracted more opposition because by then, once it was used in Race to the Top, it appeared more than it had originally been to be a federal program. One of its beauties was the fact that governors agreed across states to agree on a curriculum, but it's not so clear now whether that original idea has survived as it has become part of the kind of national conversation about education.
Okay.
I don't know if you wanted to ask this
Well,
one. or
would
not.
you like to answer one more question?
I'm
Or
happy
have
to.
you- Yeah.
What made you decide you wanted to be involved in education?
So I became involved in education because I was aware at a pretty young age how incredibly variable schools were. I had felt that most of what I learned came from what I learned at home from my parents, and that my own experience in school was just occasionally very good and often not. And it seemed to me that as a person who was interested in lots of things when I was in high school, that as I moved on to college and took more coursework, I, for better or for worse, began to think of teaching as something where I would be able to engage in academic ideas and intellectual content very deeply and in complicated ways, but be able to contribute something back to society using those skills. So I had been a French major in college. I never became a French teacher, but my interest in other people's thinking was kindled by being a language major. And so the combination of being interested in other people's thinking and wanting to change the way society uses schools drew me into education.